understanding the history of actually help individual citizens.
Policy questions that the government might have about these kind of long-term changes in operations.
And actually, when I talk about leadership, this is
So next, we would like to welcome Professor Gabriel Leung. He's from University of Hong Kong and also the Executive Director of Hong Kong Jockey Club. He also has experience in policy-making capacity in Hong Kong. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Professor Gabriel Leung.
Thanks so much. May I have my slides, please? First of all, thank you to the organizers for bringing me here, and Saren has done so much to make life easy. And of course, it's great to be on the same panel with colleagues from really a long time that we've worked together. So I was given the task of telling stories for 10 minutes. So perhaps this is storytelling time in the first session of these side meetings just before PMAC proper starts later on this week. We have the next slide. This paper really has now been cited about 20,000 times. And of course, it's sad that it has been cited so frequently. This is actually one of the defining papers of the first 400 cases, 425 to be precise, from Wuhan in China. In fact, I finished this paper sitting in my hotel coffee shop on the sidelines of the PMAC meeting in 2020. And the reason that I show you this is to say, look, we really need to be able to respond with a huge breadth of tools at our disposal, and then really sort of zero in and try to be adaptive and flexible. PMAC that year, in 2020, if you remember, was on UHC. That was the topic of the global health agenda. Infectious diseases was the last thing on anybody's mind. But by that time, and PMAC started proper, PMAC started January 28th in 2020, there were already officially, I think 70 cases. And then what we had been doing from New Year's Eve of 2019, which was the first notification, until this time, which is barely 3 weeks, just before PMAC, I had already been to Beijing to work on this particular outbreak. And of course, I was finishing the paper when I was in Bangkok. And in fact, this is the only paper that I've ever done where the editor and the deputy editor were the peer reviewers and the copy editors at the same time. I have never had a paper that was accepted within 48 hours of submission, and the copy editor was actually the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal. But scientifically, the interesting thing about this particular paper is, this is of course the classical epicurve. The lighter colors were the cases that were not linked to the Huanan seafood market. So just from looking at the color shading here, you see in fact the first 1, 2 cases were not linked to the seafood market. The third was, 4th, 5th, 6th were not. So you could already see that, well, yes, the amplification center might have been there, but certainly in terms of really was that ground zero, it's still, or it was already a very open question. The other thing that I used to teach, and I actually went to London, seeing that this is a London School co-sponsored event, I went to give this talk just after this came out. I was in London mid-February in 2020, and Peter Piot asked me to to give a talk at the London School because it was sort of hot off the press. So I said to the students, never believe an epi-curve in an emerging, still ongoing epidemic. Because if you actually just casually look at this epi-curve, the whole thing is over. But for an ongoing outbreak, that's simply because of time lag. The epi-curve of a growing outbreak will inevitably look like this. And that's a major pitfall if you actually believe, just casually glancing at the shape, then you get it wrong. Because obviously it went on to grow and grow and grow. Next slide. So the next slide is actually from the same paper. And these were the key intervals that you would try and estimate in modeling because these intervals allow you to make certain assumptions, and then you can try to project and try to do nowcasting and forecasting. Without these key intervals, you couldn't do anything. You'd just be guessing. And before these key intervals became available, if you wanted a prior, you would have no choice but to go back to look at the other coronaviruses and assume that they have similar epidemiological characteristics, which is what actually some of the very, very earliest models actually did. But having said all that, two things. One, this is a classical incubation period. This has not just public health implications, but clinical implications, of course. This is a serial interval, which is not the same as generation time, but close enough. But it's very fragile. It's actually based on six pairs of case contacts. Six. That was it. The whole world relied on this 6 clusters of case contacts. Actually, it's 6 pairs, but 5 clusters. The whole world relied on this for about 2 months. Very, very fragile. So be careful, be careful. It's good that it turned out to be correct, but it could have been very wrong. Next slide. Now, this is a paper that Jocelyn Clark edited as executive editor of The Lancet back in the day. She was just emailing me last night and said, hey, I remember 3 years ago, almost to the day, I was editing your paper. Well, this was the paper that she was editing. And this paper basically said, look, we have absolutely no idea how big it might grow. And an earlier version of this paper was actually submitted to The Lancet, which they very wisely turned down until we got more data. And once we have more data, then they very sensibly took it and then published it, because this was the first, it actually went live on the 28th or 29th of January, telling the world that this is going to grow very, 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 very big. And these were the projected epi-curves using some sort of assumptions about the force of infection, and in terms of whether the zoonosis was mostly responsible for the early clusters or actually it had gone human to human from the very, very beginning, from the get-go. And then very specifically for major cities across China, giving some predictions of how many cases there had already been. So this was a nowcasting paper to say, obviously, testing, reporting were imperfect as they would be anywhere at the very, very beginning of a completely novel pathogen, but this was most likely what had already happened. And Thailand actually played a key role in allowing us to do this paper. There were 2 things. One is very, very good pickups at the borders. So there was no way of estimating how big the Wuhan cluster really was until Japan and Thailand actually picked up imported cases. Once that happened, and you can get airline passenger volume data, then you can make certain assumptions, and then you can say, well, if it manages to throw out these X number of exported cases to these places, and given the air traffic volume, then the original cluster size must be at least that big. And then using that, then we use big data for train Spring Festival related travel, which is the largest human migration that is ongoing, by the way. And we then said, well, this is what could happen unless something major is done, which, of course, China did on the 23rd of January 2020. It essentially locked the entire country down. And within provinces and within cities, within any particular province. So Thailand really played a very, very key role. I remember being on the phone with Dr. Suet, who is my most reliable Thai public health guru. And in times like these, it's very, very useful because there were only two people that I picked up the phone to. Three. I needed data from Thailand. I needed data from Japan because these were the two places that picked up the Wuhan cases. So I rang Dr. Keizo Takimi for Japan, and I rang Dr. Suet in Thailand. And they were very, very forthcoming in sharing the data because this is a very serious global health issue. And the third person I called was my contact in Tencent, which is the WeChat app. So they had all the data of the train travel patterns. And so with those three key sources of data, this actually came out, and we turned out to have been correct. Unfortunately for the world, but fortunately for the research team. Next slide. Then, I remember Sumia, the chief scientist of the WHO, co-convened with Jeremy Farrar, who is now the designate chief scientist of the WHO, but still the director of the Wellcome Trust, co-convened a R&D meeting at WHO in Geneva. That was probably February 2020. I remember it very distinctly because I was asked to go to this meeting in Geneva. I flew from Hong Kong to Geneva after Thailand. And then the morning that I got in, I finished the morning session. I chaired the epi session, and I finished it. And then I got a call from Maria van Kerkel, who's still the COVID lead for the WHO. And Maria said, oh, where are you? I said, I'm in Geneva. Where are you? She said she was in Beijing. And she said, well, please get on the next flight. We need you in Beijing. So this was the reason, because there was a joint mission. This is not the famous or infamous joint mission on Origins. This is not. This actually predated the Origins mission by a lot. This took place in February 2020. So there were 13 people, 6 from the Chinese side, 6 from the WHO side, and I was the odd one out because I was supposed to be nominated by both sides. So we then had this joint mission, and these 13 people went to 4 provinces, obviously Wuhan, Guangzhou, Beijing, and Shenzhen. We went to these places, and we looked around, and we produced the first report, which was, again, largely confirming the epidemiological picture and the public health implications of COVID. And that report came out in the ensuing 2-3 weeks, and that really sort of set the scene for the declaration of the public health emergency of international concern, the FAIC, that was declared. This is not the first joint mission that I sat on. Unfortunately, the last one I sat on was also a human catastrophe in West Africa. That was in 2015, but those were mostly the sort of review reports. You'll remember that there was a WHO one, there was a UN one, there was a London School, Harvard joint one, and then there was a fourth one convened or led by the National Academy of Medicine in the US. So this came out February 28th officially. And next slide. One of the side benefits of teaching is that you have students all over the place. And when you are on these joint missions, you travel, and then the people who receive you were once upon a time your students. So when I was in Guangzhou, which is in the southern province of Guangdong, just north of Hong Kong in China, I ran into my students who actually came to see us to give testimony right straight out from the ICU. They were caring for COVID patients. And then they said to me, hey, there is something kind of weird going on. We've got this huge data set. would you please help us make some sense of it? Well, this is the huge data set, and basically they were all case contact pairs, very, very detailed line list information. And this is the chief of the ICU in one particular hospital, who was once upon a time my student. And he's a clinician, so he has no idea what to do with it. So I took it, and then I looked at it, and I said, well, you know what this shows? This actually shows pre-symptomatic transmission, i.e., about day -3 before symptoms appear, COVID would start to spread. And this is the original Wuhan strain. Of course, Omicron is even worse. And that's why it is so difficult to control. And if you sort of go back 20 years exactly to this day with SARS, SARS was much more easily controlled because peak infectivity was when fever spiked at the highest, and that was about day 5 to 7 after first symptoms. So long as you lock up all of the fever patients, then you're laughing. But this thing spreads day -3. And that's really it boils down to it, this was actually the most important diagram. Next, and I believe it is my penultimate slide. Left panel, right panel, key figure is this one, key figure is that one. They appear in 2 different publications, this one in Nature Medicine, this one in Lancet ID, both very, very good journals, from 2 different teams using 2 different modeling approaches. This was a team led by the Imperial Group, Neil Ferguson, who I knew when we were both very junior during SARS, and we worked together during that time. This was my team. Trying to figure out what is the case fatality risk. So how deadly is this thing? When you get the exact same results using 2 different data sets, 2 different modeling approaches, the Imperial team and actually us working together with Mark Lipsich's team at Harvard, I reached out to Mark Lipsich and I said, Mark, we needed to get this out within a week. We probably are so tired by that point that we probably might have made some mistakes in the code. And I said, I need you to completely replicate it. He very, very readily obliged. And therefore, you've got 3 teams on 3 different continents getting the same results. We're pretty sure. Final slide. Oh, this story is wonderful. Since 2009, the last flu pandemic, we started to have these experiments with Don Milton. You may remember him. He moved from Harvard to Maryland. He's still at Maryland. And he does these Gesundheit machines, G2 machines, which basically gets infected patients to breathe into a big machine and collect viral particles. We showed, using that setup, that for coronaviruses, not for COVID, okay, it's just the 4 human coronaviruses, that a mask absolutely stops it. And that is why you see me putting on a mask, because I'm still a COVID virgin. With that, I thank you, and I hope I've told a good story for you to discuss and to seed your questions and answers. Thank you very much indeed.